Thank you very much, Noel, for, as Martin said, a very, very detailed and very, very interesting setting out of all the thinking that you've been going through at the EMA. You ended your presentation saying it's not if, but how the EMA is going to achieve this, and said that that was in response to public demand for more transparency when it comes to clinical trials. Some of that public demand, I would say, thank you, Martin, for also suggesting, is down to the campaign that I'm representing here today, the All Trials campaign for clinical trial transparency. If I may say so myself, it's been a very successful campaign pushing for more data transparency. In case you don't know it, it was founded 2 years ago in response to the truly dreadful situation that around half of all clinical trials that have been carried out on medicines we use today have never published results. So we don't know what was found out about medicines that we're taking now and will probably continue to take for decades to come in those trials. It's a problem that's been recognized for decades, for more than 30 years now, I think, but hasn't been fixed. There's been an ongoing culture of secrecy and a lot of foot dragging around this issue. The aim of the campaign has been to cut through that foot dragging, to reframe the issue and expose the delaying tactics and obfuscation that has been going on in the very, very specialist conversations that up until now have been happening about this among legislators and regulators, companies, and a small number of academics and specialist journalists. What we've tried to do is reframe the issue as one of public interest and to bring in new voices. Because as I said, it used to be only companies and very specialist academics who talked about this at all, and then in specialist publications and behind closed doors. Some of those new voices that we've brought in have been patients, 50 of whom wrote to the EMA 2 years ago as we launched the campaign, saying that the lack of action on this, the lack of action on data transparency when they had volunteered to participate in clinical trials on the understanding that what was found would be of use to patients like them in the future, and when they found out that that's not the case, that was an enormous betrayal of their trust. And they wrote quite an angry open letter to the EMA 2 years ago saying, this is a betrayal of our trust. Please help us take action on this. Another of the voices who have recently joined the campaign are company investors. So a group of 85 pension funds and asset managers from around the world who are worth between them more than 3.5 trillion euros. That's trillion, big number. Recently joined the campaign and are calling on the companies that they have holdings in to take action on transparency. So we've got patients, we've got doctors, we've got massive investors all adding their voices, calling on legislators and regulators to take action on this. And a small number of companies are too. A small number, but a significant number, I think, of companies have pushed ahead in their thinking on this, making themselves more transparent, some of whom are introducing quite radical measures to open up their cupboards and get their skeletons out and get the information out there. But, and we've got to be clear about this, not everyone has moved towards talking about the how. There are still people saying this isn't a problem. The companies who are forging ahead are doing so despite the majority of the industry and their industry bodies still framing the issue as, well, the problem is in hand now because there are going to be new laws and the future is going to be different, so things are moving ahead. Whereas we know that the vast majority of medicines we use now were tested in clinical trials decades ago, and therefore it's those trials from decades ago that need to be exposed. So even though the law is going to change in Europe, possibly next year, possibly the year after that, so there will be a lot more transparency around drug trials soon, the campaign is still and has to be still focused on measures to get that old information that would be genuinely useful for medical practice today out there. We know that there are people saying that this isn't a problem. At the time of the negotiations around the new clinical trials regulation, which Noel mentioned, we heard that, and this won't be a surprise to Martin or anybody in this room, I'm sure, that more than 300 lobbyists from the pharma industry were there and thereabouts in Brussels saying, the majority of them, the status quo is okay, lobbying for the status quo, and that transparency would damage their business. We were able to overturn that, and we ended up with a law that is going to be pretty good and will mean a lot more transparency in the future by introducing, as I said earlier, a lot of new voices into the discussion. So we encouraged the supporters of our campaign, which now number 90,000 people and 600 organisations worldwide, to write to their MEPs, to write to their health ministers, to write to their governments, and ask them to listen to not just the voice from the industry, but a wide range of other voices talking about transparency. And we know that that helped MEPs and people inside agencies have a new set of points to make and have some support and something they can reach to be able to answer some of the other industry voices that they were hearing, which is very, very satisfying to hear indeed. Now that the EMA is consulting on the how, we're still seeing that we and the people we represent in the campaign and the thousands of people who are coming along with us need to be there, continually making sure the issue is framed as, what are we going to do that's the best for patients? What are we going to do that's best for medicine and for science? We'll be there raising the scientific and the ethical reasons for transparency and helping new voices be heard. When the EMA introduced its policy 70 that Noel talked about, in the early versions of it, a number of early drafts in fact, contained clauses on the format and shareability of the data that the EMA was intending to release that would not have allowed independent researchers to properly scrutinise the benefits and harms of the medicines that the data related to. It couldn't have been downloaded, it couldn't have been shared and really compared. A vast amount of data couldn't have been compared across big sets, therefore it would really not have been useful for properly getting into scrutinising benefits and harms. That clause remained part of the policy right to the end, really, and again, at the last minute, it was individual citizens, doctors and patients writing to the EMA, as well as work from the Ombudsman's office, whose letters were tabled. These citizens' letters were tabled at the last EMA management board meeting, and that was when a proper discussion of the implications of these clauses was had, when more voices and more people got involved in the conversations. Right now, the proposal from the EMA on anonymising data before it's released to the public, the proposal on what should happen to that data before it can be accessed by researchers or scrutinised by independent people, again, seems to be slightly lacking in usefulness as far as we can see. The proposal calls for a huge amount of work to be done by the producers of that data, on the data, before it's released. In essence, it means running a whole load of analyses again on an anonymised data set. Two problems that we can see with that. One of which is that may work for companies now who have a lot of resources and who are able to do this, but it may not work for people who don't have the time and resources to do that, independent researchers, academics, and so on. And the second problem, the bigger problem, is if the EMA accepts that complicated and burdensome proposal for anonymising data, it will become, whether intended to or not, the gold standard. Once a proposal like that is accepted by an agency or a regulator, it will become the standard by which everybody working on this is judged. Because it's burdensome and complicated and resource heavy, it's going to give people who don't want to start releasing data an excuse not to do so. As I said, our campaign is focusing on getting old information out there and encouraging academics and government funders and companies to open up their archives and get information out there. If they look at this complicated and burdensome apparent standard of work they have to do in that information before they release it and see just how burdensome and resource heavy it's going to be, well, that's an excuse not to do it. So again, we need to find more voices and more people telling the agencies and the regulators that they need to keep in mind the public interest in this and the public good of making it as easy as possible to share as much information as possible. So in conclusion, the lessons we've learned in the last couple of years running this campaign are that we need to ensure that the issue, the problems being talked about, are the real problems. We are continually finding that we have to reframe the issue away from, well, there's new laws, so it's going to be fine in the future, back to, no, what are we going to do about the past, where the information is actually the most useful. The future is fine, let's try and sort out the past now. And that making sure other voices, doctors and patients, progressive companies, are heard in these discussions has been the centre of everything we've done, and we're going to continue to do it.